Morning, everybody, and welcome to a business spotlight with Rob, a very interesting gentleman. We're an interesting company and an interesting background. But first, Rob, tell us all about your business, Intelligent Omics.
Thanks, Tim. Great to join you. Yeah, so Intelligent Omics started life as a Nottingham Trent University spin-out, based on the academic work of a professor called Graham Ball. And Graham had created an artificial intelligence approach to the analysis of large biological data sets. So in biology and in disease, we create a lot of data. And the problem is, what do we do with it? How do we analyze it? And so much of it's very hard to do in an efficient manner. So mathematics can help us a lot here. And we've developed a set of machine learning or artificial intelligence approaches just to automate that. So we can let that data that's generated from patient tissue, patients with different diseases, the disease tissue can be analyzed from a genetic point of view or different levels of detail. We deal in transcriptomics, which is the process of translation of a genetic code to a protein, and proteomics, which is a data set which reveals what proteins are expressed. And we take that data and we try to determine what particular molecules are driving the disease. Okay. Now we offer that as a service to large pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies who want to know what way they can attack a disease by developing either a new drug to it or a diagnostic panel. And we can give them the information that they can't gain themselves, because we have this technology that allows us to reveal information and intelligence from these large data sets, which ultimately lets them develop new drugs. We also have our own interest in developing new drugs within the company as well. So there are certain diseases, particularly in oncology and neuroscience, where we are interested in revealing the drivers of these diseases and then ultimately creating our own drugs towards them.
Wow, that's a lot to take in there. So let's just dive in a little bit, so the layman can actually understand this. So essentially, what we're talking about, we capture data throughout the whole process, and we have that huge data set, and using AI and the tool itself, we analyze that to get the outcome.
Yeah, and data comes in all different shapes and sizes when it comes to patients and diseases. So, look, from you take a patient with lung cancer, and the first piece of data is, are they male, are they female, then what age they are, and you start to stack up all this data. If you can extract tissue from the patient, you can then subject that patient tissue to all kinds of different analysis, which gives you more and more data, which you can associate with their gender, with their age, with their ethnicity, with whether they smoke or not. And all this starts to build up a tremendous amount of data. The problem we have, it's without tools, we can't analyze it. So it's really important that we employ mathematics to develop algorithms to let that maths tell us more about the data. So what are the associations? What patterns are we seeing? And if we can take those patterns and interpret them, then that allows us to develop new drugs against them in a more meaningful way.
Right, that's really interesting. So basically, we've got all this, and basically, what we're actually doing is defining and making it into, in effect, an arrow point. So they
Yeah,
can actually do something with what's actually happening, the capture of it, to actually then develop the drugs, whether it's you or big pharma or whoever, to enable us to actually fight the disease.
this is it, Tim. I mean, the problem is that without that arrow point, without that so what, then we can't do anything with data. We can collect data until the cows come home, unless we can convert that to something that makes a difference. then it's kind of a pointless endeavor. And our whole mission is to make that data meaningful so that people can take action against the output, the intelligence and the information. And that action needs to be a better diagnostic so that we can predict when people are going to get ill, or a better therapeutic so that we can treat them once they are ill.
That's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, sort of we don't. And how did that idea come about? I mean, sort of.
Well, I mean, 20 years or so ago, it became apparent that that we were just increasing the amounts of data that we were generating, and a whole practice called bioinformatics became very well developed. So this is basically uh, mathematics applied to biological data, or statistics applied to biological data in particular, right? Because biological data comes from a certain context. It's and essentially the analysis of very complex system, which is the human body, and trying to understand that, very basic information like gender or age. How do we integrate that with very complicated data like what is going on in an individual cell within an individual organ, right? So all of this is really important in order to understand disease. And I think 20 or so years ago, we realized we couldn't really extract the value out of all this data that we could with traditional means. So mathematics got involved, and since then we've really started to understand more and more and more. So this, reached a bit of a crescendo maybe 10 years ago with the or even longer when we mapped the human genome. But that's really only a starting point, because the human genome is just a kind of a blueprint, right? Now, what's really important is, out of that blueprint, what is converted to reality, and how does that change in disease? And so you need mathematics in order to interpret data, to understand these changes, to make sense of the blueprint and how it changes in disease, because a normal human being is very complicated. When you introduce a disease to that human being, it becomes even more complicated. And so the art of this is to understand what those changes are in the human that allow us to intervene, to stop the disease by either changing habits or applying a new medicine.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I suppose as well, I mean, I know because you're involved with it as Chief Scientific Officer of Northern Ireland, and involved with the government apparatus here.
I
So,
was for a while. I'm not that in that role anymore. But for 2.5 years, until the beginning of this year, yeah, I represented Northern Ireland on Chief Scientific Advisors Network. Yeah.
but I suppose this sort of thing again is actually being used at the top levels of planning for government, etc.
Well, it does in many ways. I mean, we've it goes without saying that we've been through an interesting experience over the last 5 years from a public health perspective. So, we were exposed to a pandemic where biology and the interrogation of data from biology really proved its worth. So, many people were dying from an infection that we didn't understand, and we had to very quickly isolate what the agent was that was causing that infection, characterized it using all these techniques that I'm describing, characterized it so that we can understand how we might develop, diagnose it effectively, right? So the tests that we use every day had to be developed. We kind of take those for granted, but there was a lot of biology quickly went into that simple test. Is the antibody going to pick up the agent that's causing the disease to say if I've got it or not, and then we can decide what to do. So that's the first phase. And then we have to look at the agent using the biology, analyze the data, and say, okay, very quickly now, we have to develop a vaccine against this, because it's a virus, and the way that you develop a medicine towards a virus is quite often by a vaccine, so that you can expose the body to a tiny amount of the relevant biology of that vaccine to let the body develop its own antibodies against it. That's the most efficient way of clearing viruses. And all that required harvesting a lot of data very quickly, very efficiently, using things like artificial intelligence, but also traditional methods. And that really was the very best example of how public health systems use cutting edge biology to understand the problem and develop a solution. And it's quite amazing what we achieved. And now we're over it. It's a luxury we have to forget about it and move on. But you can't underestimate the impact of biology to save countless lives, to get countless economies back on track, to put countless people back into work. It really was an incredible period.
Well, again, I'm absolutely fascinated. So, how come you came? I know you got a PhD, academic. Um, how come you got involved in business?
So that's an interesting question, Tim. So yeah, I was fascinated by science as a young adult, and did my degree in pharmacology. Was fascinated by biological processes in disease, particularly in the brain. So I then did a PhD in neuroscience, looking at stroke and how stroke happened, and can we understand it? It's really fascinating. But it became clear to me personally that I'm driven by impact. I need to make a difference, and I felt there was too much of a lag in universities between understanding science and curing people. And so my direction of travel was towards industry, because I felt that my skills could be employed in the most efficient way to understand science and then have an impact on patients. Now, when you're developing medicines, efficiency is put into stark contrast, because look, I've had a nearly 25-year career, and the closest I've got to a medicine on the market is testing one in patients. It's never so, and that's pretty typical of people who develop drugs. Most of my peers never develop a drug that gets on the market, and that's the whole problem with drug discovery, is that if you take 100% of people trying to discover new drugs, only 10% of that effort is ever converted into a new drug. But still, you're the closest you're going to get to have an impact, and that's what drove me into business. I wanted to have the maximum amount of impact, the most efficient way to use the skills I have, and business for me, and industry, I felt was the best place for me to do that, the most efficient way to make a difference.
That's fascinating. And what's been your biggest learning from being in business then?
Oh, there's so many, Tim, but essentially it's really important if you're in business to understand. So business relies on innovation and a market. Okay. So if you're able to innovate and take science and technology and do something different, it's got to correspond to a market. Now, a market is driven by a problem where people are willing to pay for that problem, right? Or to solve that problem. Okay.
Yeah.
So in medicine, that's pretty clear in some areas. If you take cancer, for instance, then that's the best example, because nobody wants to suffer from cancer. Public health systems are willing to pay for people to develop new technologies, new medicines towards cancer. There's a very clear supply and demand there. Okay, all right. You can supply the technology. There's a demand. People don't want to die, and so that seems obvious, right? But throughout science and technology, you can never assume that just because you've invented something that people have never seen before or has never been uncovered before, that corresponds to a market. Now, as an academic, that doesn't really matter, because it's important that you just develop knowledge, right? And which is why universities are really important, right? So Nottingham University, Nottingham Trent University, these are really important institutions that just develop knowledge. But there's also a need for that knowledge to be paid for, right? So in any practice of science and technology, if you want to make a business out of it, you have to be sure that that innovation, that invention corresponds to someone who's willing to pay for it, right? Whether it's a building technique or green energy or agriculture or medicine, if there is no connection between someone who wants to pay for it and your invention, then you will struggle to make a business out of it, right? And that's the important thing in business. There's always got to be a gap in the market, right? But to coin a cliche, there has to be a market in the gap, right? And that takes years and years to understand, hone, get right. And, you know, I don't always get it right. I'm quite often seduced by really cool technology and have to remind myself to make sure that people are going to pay for it, because if they don't pay for it, there's no business there. And so that's the key to business, is always make sure you've got a demand, especially if you're in the high tech area, because it's so easy to get wrapped up in cool stuff. But never forget that somehow you've got to find someone who wants to pay for it. So always, I would say, always start with the problem. If there's a massive problem that people want to pay for but can't because there's no solution, that's your business opportunity. Always work back from there, then go and find the technology.
Yeah, so don't be distracted by bright, shiny things. So,
No, no, a lot of discipline needed. Yeah.
fantastic. And in terms of your business, Intelligent Omics, what challenges do you see going forward with that?
I mean, the biggest challenge for us really is connecting to our customer base. So we're based in the UK, which is probably the best place to do medicines development in Europe, right? But the market is really in the US. So the United States market for novel medicines is the biggest in the world by miles. Um, it's got a much more amenable way of paying for medicines. It's much more of a marketplace, whereas the NHS and European health systems are very difficult to deal with because they're publicly funded. Now, whether you think that's the right thing or not is neither here nor there. If you're talking about selling a product into those systems, it's easier in the US because it's privately funded and much more market driven. So the challenge for us as a UK company that's largely providing a service to people developing drugs is to get into that market and articulate our proposition and differentiate what we do to the many other people who do things that purport to be similar. And, we operate in an area of artificial intelligence, which is something of a buzzword over the last couple of years. Everybody wants to say that they're using artificial intelligence in some way, which is quite unhelpful, because there's a huge spectrum of things that are slightly artificial and slightly intelligent to things that are really complicated and can only be done by computers. There's artificial intelligence that deals with words, like large language models, and there is artificial intelligence approaches like what we use, which deal in data, numbers, large volumes of numbers. These are very, very different. And the challenge is to articulate that to people so they appreciate what we can do that they can't do now, and appreciate it in different geographies. And so, a lot of my time is spent evangelizing, articulating, trying to explain to potential customers why our solution is better than anybody else's. And that takes a lot of time and effort. And that's kind of the biggest challenge for us, is to convert brilliance of what we have in terms of a solution to revenue by articulating that again and again and again to as many people as possible in as clear a way as possible.
That is, again, fascinating. Well, this is opening up huge things, because AI, yes, it's buzz at the moment. Everybody knows it's here. We've been using it for ages, but everybody's actually saying, well, it's not a bad thing. It's when it's actually applied to certain areas, which is, well, it's revolutionary.
It can be. It can really be revolutionary. And we know AI because it tells us, what it is we should be buying based on whether Alexa has heard us talking about a new shelving unit we need from IKEA, or a new pair of tires for the car. That's artificial intelligence. It's not saving people's lives, but I presume, or I guess it's improving the quality of lives, because decision making is easier. The challenge for us is to take that and put it into a much more profound environment that can really make a difference, to protect us, to ensure that we have energy in the future, to ensure that we're we can anticipate the next pandemic and prevent it before it happens. These are all ways that we can use artificial intelligence in a very meaningful way that's built on the foundation of simple applications like, what am I going to have for tea tonight?
That's again, it is. It's put it in context, don't we? I mean, so that's the thing. When we actually put things in context, then you actually educate rather than actually um, false news or whatever you want to call it. It's absolutely interesting. So, how obviously you travel around the world a lot, etc. How do you balance your personal life with your business life?
Oh, I mean, that's a good question. I suppose I have the luxury of being quite good at compartmentalizing things. So, you have to work hard when you run the company, but it's important to switch off. It's important to protect that time. You know, the whole advent of working from home makes that a little bit more challenging because the computer is always in the next room, the job is always in the next room. It used to be, you know, 10, 15 years ago that when you left the office, you kind of left the office and then you were given a laptop and then the office seemed to come back home with you and then you were working from home and then you got out of bed, started work, and then suddenly it was dinner time and then bedtime and you were still working. It's become more difficult, right? So it's about discipline, it's about carving out that time, it's about compartmentalizing. And actually, if you think about this in a mature way, it really helps you work because I'm a big advocate of meditation, for instance. So I make sure that at least 2 or 3 times a week I meditate, which totally wipes the slate clean to allow you to think about the challenges you have at work in a totally fresh way. I mean, it's so useful for creativity, and it really helps. And actually, if you think about this in a mature way, if you do things like meditation, or maybe it's going down the gym, or maybe it's playing five-a-side football, or tennis, or whatever it is, that escape makes you so much better at work. And if you don't have that escape, you lose perspective, you stop
Yeah.
communicating properly, you get exhausted. And actually, all these things are really important. So for me, and for everybody who works with me, I really encourage that work-life balance because it makes me more impactful and effective, and it makes everyone around me more effective.
Brilliant. And finally, what is the best advice you'd give to an 18-year-old you?
Ooh, um, follow your curiosity. I mean, it's curiosity has kept me going. I'm always interested. I'm never bored. Whatever I do is fascinating. Now, it doesn't matter how hard it is or whether it's just something that's simple. So my main curiosity was how on earth does the human body work? How on earth does the brain work? Can we understand that? And then later in my career, I'm also interested in how do we make countries work economically? How do we use science and technology to drive economics? Which I'm just curious. Both of them are fiendishly difficult, but they're really curious. They're really interesting. And I think if you're always interested and curious, then you'll always do the right thing.
Brilliant. What a wonderful way to finish. Rob, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Tim.